I'm just going to begin with the acknowledgement of country. Melbourne Jewish Book Week acknowledges the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation as traditional owners and custodians of this land, and we pay our respect to their elders past and present. We also acknowledge and respect the traditional owners of the lands across Australia, their elders, ancestors, cultures and heritage. And I would also like to acknowledge the sponsors of Melbourne Jewish Book Week, because this event would not be possible without them. And in particular, the sponsors of this particular event, Sandy and Philip Benjamin. So thank you. So I'll start with a quick introduction of who I am, and then we'll get into Rivka's introduction. So my name is Elissa Goldstein. I'm on the programming committee for Melbourne Jewish Book Week, and I also moderate literary events, and this is my first moderation that is in real life, in person, because the others have all been online due to COVID, so I'm very excited to see some of you in person for the first time. And I'm from Melbourne. I was born and raised here, but I lived in New York for several years, where I got an MFA in creative writing, and I currently work at the ABC as a digital producer, so that's me. And now on to Rivka. And I'm going to give Rivka, just so you know, a kind of slightly longer intro perhaps than usual, because I want to give people the context for your work. And I think that's important for understanding your most recent novel. Rivka Galchen was born in Toronto in 1976 to Israeli parents, but grew up in Norman, Oklahoma, which I Googled, and is pretty much in the geographic heart of the United States. She moved to the East Coast for college, then went on to study medicine in New York City and train as a psychiatrist. After that, she completed a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at Columbia. Her first novel, Atmospheric Disturbances, published in 2008, won the William Saroyan International Prize for Fiction, among other awards. It's about a psychiatrist named Leo Liebenstein, who becomes convinced that his beautiful and much younger wife, Rima, has been replaced by a doppelganger, which becomes the catalyst for a peculiar international search for the real Rima, involving weather patterns, one of Leo's patients, and a meteorologist named Rivka Galchen. In 2014, she published American Innovations, a collection of absurdist, existential, fantastical, and often very funny short stories that reimagine some classics of the genre, such as The Nose by Nikolai Gogol, with female characters at the centre. This was followed by Little Labours, a delightful slim volume of essays and vignettes about babies and motherhood, and the kids' book, Rat Rule 79. In her most recent book, Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch, which I have right here, and I'll show you all, is a fictional account of the real witch trial of Katharina Kepler, who was the mother of the 17th century astronomer Johannes Kepler, who's famous for many things, but I think most well known for his laws of planetary motion, which describe the orbits of the planets around the sun. And the novel is set during a time of turmoil. There's a plague that is spreading. The 30 Years' War is about to begin. So it certainly feels very replete with meaning for this moment in the 21st century. And in addition to all of this, Rivka Galchen is an essayist and reporter. She's a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she's written articles on a range of topics, but very often on science and medicine. And I highly recommend her recent profile of the French mathematician Alexander Grothendieck, and I think I'm pronouncing his surname correctly, and also her April 2020 article about Hashim Zikri, an ER doctor in Queens, treating patients with COVID. But there's a lot of material in The New Yorker for you to browse online. And I just want to add one more thing after that intro, and then we'll go to Rivka. In the notes that are supplied to the moderators for the festival, we're told to remind the audience, to let them know what your specialisation is in this regard. And I mean, my specialisation here is really that I'm just a big fan of Rivka's writing. I'm a fangirl. It's how I sort of described myself in the social media posts about this. I remember reading Atmospheric Disturbances around the time that it came out, and it really changed my understanding of what fiction could be and could do. I'd just never read anything like it before. And I think sometimes the problem with these author intros is that you can gloss over what it actually feels like to read an author's books. So I'll just say, Rivka, that reading your fiction, in particular for me, it's like wading into the slipstream of your mind and just getting carried down the river. Your stories are strange and peculiar in the best way, kind of absurdist, and a bit Borgesian, if I'm never sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. In your stories, I feel like things seem normal at first, but then they go slightly off kilter with little diversions and get kind of existential, but there's always a sense of control from you, the author, and a kind of internal logic. So I hope that gives people an understanding of your work. Anyway, now let's hear from you. Since this is Melbourne Jewish Book Week, I thought we'd begin by playing a game of Jewish geography, but in this case, your personal geography. Can you tell us a little bit about how you once wrote that you came to be born somewhat randomly in Toronto, then your family ended up in Oklahoma, and now you're in New York, and you actually wrote that to be a vocal fan of New York is like hanging out with the popular kids. Norman, Oklahoma, where so many people I love and admire live, now that's a place that could use a fan club. Can you tell me a little bit about the places you've lived and how you ended up in New York?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm going to mention that the other side of my family lives in Sydney, Australia, and they sort of migrated there in 1969 or 1970 before I was born. But so I've always had this sense that sort of where you live is quite random in the sense that I never had cousins or anyone nearby, and I was almost always in settings growing up in Norman, Oklahoma, which you were so bold as to look up. Sort of almost the only Jewish person in town, which was just an interesting way to grow up and a kind of wonderful way to grow up. Because I remember when I went to college, I spent a lot of time at the Center for Jewish Life. It was just a really important community for me. It was a difficult year, my first year of college, because my father died unexpectedly a few weeks into it. And the Center for Jewish Life, which was like the Hillel, was like a very important community space for me. And people would say, don't you think it's so hard to be here at Princeton, which is where I went to school, because there's almost no Jewish people. And I thought, I've never met so many Jewish people in my life. So it's always been like a little bit of that dynamic. But yeah, no, I always think it's lucky for a writer. And I know that you left Australia and came all the way over to Brooklyn to study writing. I always think it's good you're fortunate when you're outside of the center, however that happens. Maybe it happens by personality, maybe it happens by geography, by religion, but in some way to be kind of naturally outside is I think really useful. Kind of people end up being writers. Maybe they would have done something more productive with their lives, but they end up being writers instead.
Hello, I'm back. I think there's something about, it's so essential to have an outsider perspective to some regard as a writer. Yeah, whether it's geographic or cultural or emotional, because it lifts you out of the story and gives you that bird's eye view to give perspective. So I can imagine that growing up in Oklahoma would be interesting. How did your family end up there? Is it your parents were both scientists, is that right?
Yeah, so my father studied math and went into applied math and ended up becoming a meteorologist, which is, most people know they're meteorologists on their television set who tells them the weather. And he wasn't someone on TV who told you the weather, but he was someone who studied weather patterns. And so there's, we lived in an amazing storm center. Norman was sort of famous for its thunderstorms and the National Severe Storms Laboratory. And my mother worked as well as a computer scientist handling kind of weather data. So again, it was just like all academics, a bit itinerant, and then the sort of landing place also being kind of determined by these outside factors.
Right. So my next question is actually about the connection between medicine and writing. I think the transition from studying medicine to literature can seem surprising, but there's also a long tradition of doctors who write fiction and create art. Do you see a connection between your medical training and your writing career, or is it more of a coincidence to you?
Yeah, that's like a question that the answer has kind of changed for me over time, which I guess is not surprising. We get older and we get different ideas about how things affected us. And the thing about medicine that I actually really miss and that I envy about the people who are practicing physicians, and of course there's many kinds of medicine, but my favorite thing in the hospital would be at night when you would do like call at night, because most of the doctors at night wear scrub outfits, which are basically pajamas, like they're sort of in pajamas, and the patients are in pajamas, and the rest of the world is asleep, and the lighting is off. There's this, I don't know, it's a strange kind of atmosphere that I think lets you sort of break out of habits and norms, and things become vivid again. So small things that you might not notice during your daily life suddenly become alive, and suddenly people who are strangers are your intimates, because you are sort of together in what's a heightened situation, certainly for the patients. You know that when you're in the hospital as a patient, you're not having a great day, and and it's not your normal life, so you've sort of eddied out into this other space. So I really do miss that forced intimacy with strangers, which I do connect to my childhood, that I never thought of friendship as something that had to do with having something in common with somebody, but rather just it was, well, of course you're going to be friends with the people near you, because when you know someone, you care about them, and when you're close to someone, you care about them. And so I'm always drawn to these kind of accidental communities, like unplanned communities. And the hospital is like a wonderful unplanned community. I mean, also a terrible one, but, and the language of medicine, I think, has a real influence on me, and maybe on anyone, like any strange language. Like I remember being really sort of shocked and disturbed before I was in medicine, seeing like my father described in a medical note, like, 52-year-old Jewish man comes in complaining. And I thought, why are they saying he's Jewish? Why are they saying he's complaining? That's terrible, or whatever. And then, when I entered into medicine, I understood that formula and what it was about, and why it's phrased that way, and why everything was relevant. And just that kind of slight shift where you're still in the English language, it's still completely legible, but kind of the objective is shifted, and so everything sounds different. I don't know, I love that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Great. So coming into your writing, there's one recurring theme that I've noticed, and that is people disappearing. But this is, just to clarify, not in a murder mystery sense. In your stories, the manner of disappearing is elusive. It often bends into unreality, and there are sometimes characters left behind in stories who are engaged in this sort of slippery search for the person who's disappeared. And there's often mysterious signs and messages. So this occurs in atmospheric disturbances, where the psychiatrist goes off in pursuit of his, real wife, not the imposter who's allegedly appeared. And there are multiple, actually, disappearances in that book, characters who sort of come and go and who are elusive. And in Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch, Katharina, who is the protagonist. Her husband, we learn, sort of keeps running off to war, and she keeps going to retrieve him. And eventually he just disappears, and it actually occurred to me she's basically an aguna. She's left by a husband and no one really knows what's happened to him. And in your short story, The Region of Unlikeliness, there is a young female narrator who develops an infatuation with a kind of mysterious older man who disappears, and then she's looped into this weird time travel paradox. And in your most recent piece for The New Yorker, you profile the French mathematician Alexander Grothendieck, who disappeared from society at the height of his career. Left academia behind and became a recluse. So I'm just wondering if that is something that is conscious to you when you're writing, and what it means to you that that is a recurring theme.
First of all, I forgot to say what I wanted to say earlier, which is that I feel super lucky to get to speak with you. And we chatted on email a little bit before, and I felt like I don't know, like I was learning things about reading, and that's what I value, in a companion. And so I feel really lucky to get to speak with you. And it's funny because when you make that list, I think, oh yeah, obviously, that's a through line for me. But it's definitely not conscious, even though, of course, I have all sorts of kind of post facto ideas about it. I've always, the strongest one to me, when I wrote my first novel, Atmospheric Disturbances, it was definitely the most uninhibited writing process I'll probably ever have, because when you're writing your first novel, you're kind of just writing for yourself. You're just keeping yourself entertained. And that's actually a wonderful thing. You're not kind of necessarily super conscious of what emotions you might be revealing. Instead, you're just conscious of how you're making your patterns and how the patterns please you and how you want to build this totally fictional world, which of course is filled with your own emotions. But I think, one, I've always felt that it's not uncommon. A friend recently said, oh, we're all carrying our sort of 30-pound bag of grief or whatever. And it's sort of true. I think everybody is. And I think it's not an uncommon strategy when somebody loses a person, either because the person has died or a relationship has ended, or in whatever way we lose people, to have a feeling that we haven't actually lost them and that we might see them tomorrow. We just haven't seen them for a while. So I sort of feel like that sense of someone who is gone away is still present. They're present in our kind of sense of expectation that they're going to drop by at any moment. Has a lot to do with the kind of vanishings or threatened vanishings that reappear a lot in my book. And I think it's a ubiquitous kind of universal human feeling, that kind of reaching out for something that was once there and isn't there, even when it's something more theoretical. I often feel that the process of getting older or growing up is a strange, way of losing your earlier self, your past self, even though they're still with you. So they're sort of in you like a kind of nesting doll. They pop up every once in a while, but also there is that feeling oh, there was someone I knew, even if that person is you, age 7, and I haven't seen them in a while, and where did they get to, what's happened to them? So I think that emotionally must feed it, although I always try to, when I'm writing, I always try in a funny way to really stick to the surface and really stick to the shape and pattern of things as a way of not worrying about what the emotions are and letting the emotions be true as opposed to what I wish they would be. Because I always feel like if I try and control the meaning or emotion in a story, then I'll write fantasy literature without it being labeled fantasy literature. So I see it after the fact, but I don't see it so much in the moment.
Right. I think that there's a way that in the writing process, characters will reveal themselves to you and do certain things that you don't expect. And that is organic to the process. And if you try to sort of superimpose a broader political message or a psychological message. It can feel heavy-handed, you know, so that makes a lot of sense. Now, I thought that we could get into Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch. And would you just begin perhaps by explaining the structure of the novel, because we hear multiple voices throughout, and maybe just situate the audience in what is happening at the time and how you stumbled across this true story that you fictionalized.
Yeah, I'd love to. So Katharina Kepler is a sort of illiterate but very intelligent, capable, semi-widowed, as you alluded to, mother of Johannes Kepler. Johannes was her third child. They did not come from a moneyed family, a well-off family, an educated family. They were Lutherans in a relatively open-minded part of the country, but also had to relocate several times because they were Lutherans, living in the Holy Roman Empire. And, you know, Johannes is, on the one hand, is already at the time of the trial his mother goes through, he's already the imperial mathematician for the emperor, but at the same time, he's sort of never getting paid. He's always getting in trouble. He's still under threat. So his position is quite unstable. And basically a series of petty things end up kind of opening the juggernaut of the law, which then starts this trial to see if Katharina Kepler is a witch. She's about 70 years old at this time. She's probably the oldest woman in her entire town, sort of. That's not something for sure, but the life expectancy, she was quite old. We would think of a 70-year-old, not as that old now, but she would have been one of the oldest people in town. She's quite vulnerable, even though her children have done well. And she is unable to defend herself because she's, one, a woman, and a woman's not allowed to defend herself from these accusations of being a witch. And she's too illiterate, so she's really not able to follow the process in detail. And so as this trial gets going, which everyone has a hard time believing is really happening because it's so consequential and it's so devastating and it's so absurd, that the family has a little bit of a delay time in understanding that they have to actually take this process quite seriously. So that's sort of the setting of the book. And the book is told from her perspective. She tells her neighbor, because she's illiterate, her neighbor, who she's befriended, who is a sort of eccentric, rather lonely, older saddle maker. He writes down her story on her behalf, and he becomes her legal guardian. And he has his own secrets, so he sort of stands by her. And so we hear from her perspective, we hear from his perspective, and then we get parts of the depositions from townspeople, sort of explaining their interactions with her. And one of the things about this time period is that she really did need to fear for her life. There were a lot of women who had been tortured or burned or otherwise killed in terrible ways, just like, you know, kind of 30 kilometers down the road. So it was something very real. And at the same time, the kinds of things that she was being accused of were things like riding a goat backwards, or that 25 years earlier she had touched a pig's paw and then the pig had died, or that she had sort of offered a cure for a woman's rash, and that the rash had not gotten better, and in fact, you know, they've gone lame, or that she could open doors that were locked, etc. And when you look closer at all of the accusations, which fortunately are preserved, even though it's hard to find historical information about quote unquote minor characters, because Kepler was her son, in the collected writings of Kepler, you can find the entire transcript of the trial and the depositions and the various letters. So Kepler isn't living nearby at the time, and it takes a little while, almost a year, before he knows this is going on. It's unclear why the family kept it from him. But I had some ideas which I put into the novel, and that's sort of the setting. So it goes between the different voices and different people's understanding of what's happening and why.
Great. Could I get you to just read for everyone the very beginning of the novel, the introduction, where we hear from her and her voice?
Yeah, just 1 second, let me pull it up. So, I'm having trouble. Sorry, right before we started this, my book vanished. So I suddenly don't have it, but I thought I had it on my computer. Could you read it for me? I bet you'll do a better job.
Okay, I'll read it so we hear from her.
Okay, thank you.
Stepping in for Rivka. Herein I begin my account with the help of my neighbour Simon Sattler, since I am unable to read or write. I maintain that I am not a witch, never have been a witch, am a relative to no witches, but from very early in life I had enemies. When I was a child, our cow mare at my father's inn was cross and bitter toward me. I don't know why. I wouldn't hesitate to put a blue silk ribbon on her neck if she were here today. She died from the milk fever, which was no doing of mine, though as a young child I felt it was my doing, because Mare had kicked me and I had then called her fat-kidneyed. Was she my enemy? It takes time and experience to gain a cow's trust. Now I'm 70-some years old. I'll spend no more time on the enemies or loves of my youth and middle age. I'll say only that I've never before had even the smallest run-in with the law, not for fighting, not for cursing, not for licentiousness, not for the pettiest theft. Yet attributed to me in this trial is the power to poison, to make lame, to pass through locked doors, to be the death of sheep, goats, cows, infants, and grapevines, even to cure at will. I can't even win at backgammon, as you know. If my defence fails, a confession will be sought through torture, first with thumb screws, then with leg braces, then with the rack, or something like that. It depends who the council hires for the job. If mercy is taken upon me, I'll be beheaded and then burned. If no mercy is taken, I'll be burned without first being beheaded. That happened to 7 women last year in Regensburg. My children, with some help, have been coordinating my defence. There are 2 things a woman must do alone. She does her own believing and her own dying. So says Martin Luther. Or so you say that Martin Luther says, or said. I was born the year Luther died. I took Catholic communion only one time, in error. My daughter Greta is married to a pastor who says that's okay. My son Hans agrees. I hold Luther in the highest esteem. He too was vilified. Again, I'm grateful to you, Simon, for sitting with me, for writing for me, for being my legal guardian. This is my truest testimony. I thought Katharina was such an interesting character. She's got this really distinctive voice, often a very wry sense of humour, quite no nonsense, which can sometimes lead her to be blundering and impolitic, which is not advantageous when she is accused of being a witch. She kind of reminded me of, you know, that there's that poem by Jenny Joseph called Warning, when I am a woman, I shall wear purple. It's kind of like a famous British Jewish poet. She has that vibe, that energy, but in a medieval sense. And to me, the thing that is so mysterious and kind of magical about historical fiction, especially set in medieval times or ancient times, is how you access a voice or an emotional experience of someone who lived so distant to when we are living now. How did her voice come to you, and how did you kind of develop her character as in a fictional sense?
I mean, the main thing was that I had a lot of fun. So it was a lot of fun. And what gave me confidence, because there was a part of me that sort of thought, this person's life is too alien from my life. I can't actually, I had that anxiety. Of course I did. But I felt like there were two things that gave me like a sense of confidence. And honestly, her voice came to me quite easily. I sort of could hear it and felt that it was the right voice. And one of the places that came from was that I did think she was the mother of one of the greatest mathematicians of the past 500 years. And, we have these stereotypes about mathematical people, and they're not completely true, but they're a little bit true. And I found that from my own family, that there's, I thought of her as one of these personalities who feels like, well, what I've said is sort of accurate and logical, and therefore that's the end of the conversation. When of course that's not the way most people go through life. Feelings are emotional, decisions are emotional, and there's something moving and almost childlike, even though it's like a special power, almost childlike about thinking that a certain kind of clarity of thinking, or the idea that something is actually true, is sufficient, that's kind of sufficient to defend you or to explain something. So I thought of her in that way as having that kind of personality, which is oddly enough a kind of quixotic personality, even though that might not be what we associate with kind of math-minded sorts of people. And then actually, like the letters of Martin Luther. So even though Martin Luther precedes her, it's a wonderful set of documents to look at his letters, because they're so personal and they feel like they were written, they could have been written yesterday. And one that really stayed with me is a letter that he writes after the death of his first child. And he writes about how surprised he is really at the intensity of his loss and grieving and emotion for such a young infant, because I think the infant was about 3 months old when it passed. And it just absolutely felt like a letter from a friend today, even though like on some level I feel we're taught to imagine that people back then, because child mortality was so common and happened to almost every family, that maybe they had a different way of coping with it. Maybe they weren't so sad. It was just life. And of course that doesn't appear to be the case at all when you look at the letters that people wrote to one another in those moments. So those were two like poles that, when I said, well, where do I think this voice is coming from? Why do I have this confidence in this voice? I'm not even, she's older than me. Her life is so different than me. And I thought, well, I don't know why I feel like this is her voice. I felt quite confident about it.
Yeah, certainly she really pops off the page. And it's interesting as well that you mentioned the loss of the child and child bereavement. There are so many, the frequency of child loss in this era is just kind of staggering. And we get glimpses into, her daughter-in-law who loses a few children, and she engages in this bargaining with God when her beloved granddaughter is unwell, take me instead of her. And I thought that you really balanced in the story the emotion of that and made it feel real, despite the fact that it would have been so frequent back then. And I think there's this way that we think, oh, did people 500 years ago feel things the way that we feel things now? And they did. It can just be hard to access that. So, I certainly found, when I was reading it, I found that very moving. Now, I think that there's so much of this novel feels so specifically, like eerily relevant to this particular moment. There's the plague that is looming, and people are constantly just getting sick and dropping dead out of nowhere. There's a lot of misinformation and superstition, and there's skepticism about science and the natural world. And, you know, Katharina is aware of this. She says, I do my best to avoid superstition, which can be difficult to separate from the quiet knowledge with which we are born and that sometimes reminds itself to us. So there were all of these interesting kind of moments in the novel where I kept thinking, gosh, this just feels so relevant to the era of COVID. You know, Katharina has this knowledge of herbal remedies, which is sort of a precursor to modern medicine, and she's able to help people, but there's this skepticism of that knowledge. It's seen as witchcraft, which just felt like so analogous to certain attitudes towards vaccines. Her daughter-in-law is literate and reads these pamphlets which convey news of witch trials and happenings in other towns, but they're kind of dubious sources, and Katharina has this skepticism about them. She's like, you know, she can't read, but she knows that you shouldn't believe everything that you read. And I don't know, I'm just wondering as well, is this something that you were conscious of as you were writing, and did you begin it, at what point in the last few years did you begin writing it? Because it just feels so specific to like 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because I did finish the book in the beginning of COVID, but there was, unfortunately, I'm sure Australians know about our kind of 2016 president. So there was this sort of, it was really the election in 2016 that I sort of dropped the book I was working on before. And I didn't really know why I was writing this book, but I was reading a lot about, I was reading biographies of scientists because it's like a genre that I love, I guess, because, you know, in all sorts of strange ways, whether they want to or not, scientists are often kind of intersecting with power because they are useful to people in power or they are threatening to people in power. So even though it tends to be as a class a kind of nebbishy introverted class, not exclusively, but to some extent, it has this weird way of intersecting in the public sphere quite dramatically. So I don't know, I liked reading these biographies, and I couldn't find a good biography of Kepler in English. And so I read this book about the trial of his mother, and I was just overwhelmed with a sense of connection and interest. And I can sort of analyze that now, but at the time I just had that feeling of helplessness. I connected to that feeling of helplessness when, you know, things that are like seem obviously false or obviously ludicrous, but it doesn't seem to matter. Like it doesn't seem to matter that it can seem clear what's more true and what's less true, or it can seem clear what's absurd and what is grounded in reality. And it just seemed totally irrelevant to decision making and what was happening. And so I think that was the atmosphere that made this story so powerful for me, as well as the atmosphere of accusation, because as it felt that like the citizens in a democracy had like, I guess in some sense felt disempowered, many of them felt disempowered. There was this sort of realm of social media where people suddenly felt, well, maybe I can be powerful in this other realm, and that I also feel didn't necessarily go so well. So like, I just felt like the strange distortions of where people tried to use power and how was the atmosphere that made this story so powerful for me, or like I was very, very drawn to it. And also I loved my main character. I think that's usually when I write, it's because I sort of think this seems like an interesting person to spend time with. And I just thought she seems like an interesting person I thought, who is this woman who lived so long, who in a certain way accomplished a tremendous amount. She did end up basically raising her children on her own because she married a man who had certain kind of romantic tendencies to want to be at war, and maybe had some mental illness as well. So she was sort of all alone, and she kind of pulled it off, like in just some basic way. I thought, who is this? She said, it's kind of amazing to me. So I think that's how it came to be.
There's something very compelling about hearing about these women in medieval times, or I mean, honestly, anything predating the 20th century, who had this autonomy, owned land, did things. I mean, sometimes also as I was reading, I was thinking of, do you know about the diaries of Gluckle of Hamelin, who was a medieval Jewish woman, lived, I think, I guess in Hamelin, which is maybe near Frankfurt, and was a landowner and a businesswoman. She was widowed, young, had several children. And I mean, there are a few biographies of her, and she wrote diaries, which are translated into English, and I think you would probably love them. I'm surprised, actually, no one's written historical fiction or made a TV show about her yet. But as I was reading this, I was also thinking of her because she's this character in her diaries as well that sort of pops off the page and feels anachronistic. But there were women who did extraordinary things back then. We just don't have a lot of documentation about them and don't necessarily get to hear it. I have one more question for you, and then we'll turn over to the audience if anyone has any other questions. And that is, there's one Jewish character in this book. There's a peddler, I think that's how I describe him, a sort of an itinerant Jewish man who, at some point when Katharina needs to be secretly transported out of town, gives her a ride. And he's quite memorable. They tell each other stories. He's kind of got this chill, happy-go-lucky vibe, despite the fact that we learn that there's a dark and violent history in terms of his family being persecuted and his town being persecuted for being Jewish. Just wondering how he came to you, what made you pop him in, why you made that particular character Jewish.
Yeah, that was also, I mean, in a dark, sort of sad way, something I really enjoyed thinking about and writing. So I was very conscious the whole time I was writing the book, where I sort of thought, in a funny way, on the one hand, this is a woman being terribly persecuted, but just almost like in terms of contrast or lighting, or how to show her and how to show context around her. I felt it was really important that there be someone in a worse situation than her. And so even though her situation seems very dire and very low, she is a citizen, she has citizenship. She's a Lutheran, which was an easier thing to be at the time than Jewish. And in fact, Luther, who was such an astonishing kind of good man in many ways, but still also a horrible anti-Semitic man who sort of advocated the burning of synagogues. And it was, just to sort of give that whole pattern of the way that people thought and the layout of society. So it seemed essential to me that that her relative fortune, like her relative good luck, even in this horrible moment, be illuminated. And that seems like why there had to be someone in a worse position than her. But then also it was just almost like, from a writing perspective, there's so many kind of Jewish stories and tales from that very specific time period and area. And I couldn't resist letting them sneak into the book, even in like very short, tiny little ways. So I think that was kind of, I usually put things in not thinking about theme or meaning, but thinking about pattern and contrast and changing the energy. So that was the way he came in. But then I feel like the reason I have faith in obeying that rather than theme or meaning is because I feel like it's like a pathway to the real meaning of stories.
Yeah, and he's such a wonderful character because she also gets, in terms of the pace, a moment of respite from her persecution being with him. You know, we're in this heightened state where we're reading all of these accusations from the townspeople, some of which are hilarious, by the way. Like, they're saying horrible things about her that are untrue, but they're so fantastical and ludicrous that I was laughing out loud. But then we meet this sort of Jewish peddler, and he also has this sort of energy that is a bit like a character in like old Hasidic tales that sort of cropped up around that time. And I was almost expecting him to, like, you know, at the end of the story, it's Elijah and he's come to perform a miracle for the poor kind of woodcutter. It felt a little bit like that to me, familiar in that way. Anyway, I think we're nearing the end of the session, but we might have time for a couple of questions from the audience, if anyone has one. I can see that Tully is standing up and heading to the mic.
Hi, Rivka. I loved Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch, and I found it really propulsive and slightly traumatic maybe, which is the question that I want to ask you, is that where were you in the book when the presidency changed in terms of writing it? And did it feel like a sort of catharsis as you were writing it with the backdrop of the presidency that you began with?
So could I ask, Elissa, could I ask you to repeat it? Because I couldn't really hear the way the mic was set up. I couldn't hear the question.
Oh,
so
sure.
if you could kind of paraphrase
I'll summarize. So Tully was asking, she's read the book and found it very propulsive and was wondering if there was catharsis in the process of writing and where the writing was, at what point of time when the presidency changed. Sorry, let me rephrase that. When the presidency changed, at what point were you in the process of writing? And was there some catharsis in working through the book as there was all of this sort of political change and turmoil going on around you?
There was definitely, thank you for that question. That's a really thoughtful question. And I would say, I don't know if I had catharsis, but I had something like adjacent to it, which was that I had respite, like the book gave me respite. I'm not sort of someone who has like a relationship to pills or medicines. In fact, I have a fear of them, which is funny because I studied medicine, but maybe that's why I have such a fear of them. But the one time in my life I had to sort of go on tranquilizers was a period between the sort of euphoria of Trump being voted out of office, and then the terror that it would be inconsequential and that there would be no transfer of power. But no, I really felt that the book allowed me to think a lot about sort of communities and the way they tell stories and the way they tell dangerous stories, and that storytelling isn't always a beautiful thing, but sometimes a beautiful thing. You know, I was able to think about all these very contemporary emotions without looking directly at our historical and political moments. And so I felt like the book offered me a kind of hell when I was writing it. But I was already done with the book because of the way that books happen. And so I had already sort of actually finished it before the election happened.
I'm getting the signal that we need to wrap up, unfortunately, but I have many more questions. I wish we could talk for longer. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Rivka Galchen. Her new book is Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch, so grab yourself a copy. And yeah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you all.